We're almost 3 years into the term of RBA Governor Michele Bullock. Let's take a look at her legacy to date with one of Australia's top economic minds, none other than the Kook. Bullock is the first woman to run the RBA, and she's living through one of the toughest stretches in the bank's history. Joining me right now to dissect the legacy she's likely to leave is Stephen Koukoulas of Market Economics. Stephen, welcome. If you had to grade Michele Bullock's term so far governing the RBA, what would it be and why?
Look, I think it's about a 7 out of 10, and it's not higher because for a couple of reasons. The degree of difficulty, as you alluded to, of her 3 years in the job has been really dogged by, well, she inherited inflation being too high. Then she got inflation down, and many of us, including the RBA, were optimistic that inflation had been beaten. Then along came news that the economy was more resilient than we were thinking. And then the oil price shock back at the end of February, early March. And so therefore inflation was higher. What does she do with rates? So it's been a very difficult operational issue for her. But on the inflation front, unfortunately, it's been too high. But when we look at the unemployment rate, which is another part of the RBA's mandate, it's still low. So the unemployment rate's still at 4.5% or a little bit less. It's still remarkable. So that's why she gets a decent score from me, and in difficult times.
Okay, if her term ended today, would you call it a success?
Success. That's a very good question. Look, I think so, given the difficult circumstances that she's been operating in, and of course she's implemented the new Reserve Bank Monetary Policy Board and the changes that Treasurer Jim Chalmers brought about to the operations and functions of the RBA. That's been largely Michele Bullock's work to get it going. And I think at this stage, the fact that she gives press conferences, I'll talk about the operational rather than necessarily the economic outcomes, but on operational grounds, it's been really quite effective. The press conferences after each interest rate decision have been really well received. I know she's giving speeches at various functions through the year. She explains and articulates the RBA thinking perhaps better than some other central bank governors we've had in the past. And even though the economic outcomes are not quite like what we'd want to see, it's hardly been the result of monetary policy being ridiculously easy or misplaced that we've got this sort of lingering inflation problem.
The average mortgage holder is now paying thousands more a year than they were 12 months ago. Has Bullock managed the trade off between inflation and household pain well, or has she let borrowers carry too much of the burden?
Oh, you've actually unearthed a really important issue for how the economy and how inflation's managed. The Reserve Bank, and Michele Bullock's made this very, very clear, and it's absolutely correct. They only have interest rates to manage inflation and manage the economy. And when the economy and inflation are too high or too strong, they have to put them up. That's the very simple rule of thumb. The mortgage repayments, again, that problem that you allude to, that cost of living issue, because it's not just mortgage repayments, it's the high petrol prices as we saw them previously. That's the cost of a lot of other essential items in the consumer price index basket that have caused this grief. So she can't control those. In fact, not many people can control those things. They're outside the domain of the RBA. So that cost of living issue is unfortunately the price that people with a mortgage have had to pay. However, we know that only 1/3 of the population has a mortgage, another third rent. Okay, there's an issue of rents out there, of course, with rents increasing, but another third of people own their house outright without any mortgage. And they're the ones that are actually benefiting financially and are sort of creating or making it harder, I should say, for the Reserve Bank to hit their target because they own their house. Until very recently, house prices have been going up quite nicely in most cities, and they probably had a little bit of savings through their superannuation and other things. And so the high interest rates meant that they were actually earning more money on their term deposits and these sorts of things. So that's what's made her job particularly difficult.
Now, it's well established that households have endured a lot of financial pain on her watch. There's no question about that. Is that going to define how history judges her, fairly or not?
Look, she's still got 4 years to go in her term. It's a 7-year appointment. And as we said, it's coming up to the 3-year anniversary very, very soon. If the current consensus view of the economy is broadly correct, and that in the second half of next year, inflation's back into the target band, the unemployment rate tops out at about 4.75% and doesn't go much higher than that, and that we start, perhaps, this is just a perhaps, we get a monetary policy easing cycle very late next year or into 2028. Now, I'm really looking to the crystal ball there. Then I think she'll have done a pretty good job, because these things are, as we said, the fine tuning of them is really, really difficult. And particularly when, I think it was the case with the last board meeting, if I remember correctly, the board met, they had their decision, they left rates on hold. But then 2 days later, there was another escalation of conflict in the Middle East. Oil prices shot back up, and maybe they should have hiked or not hiked. So when you've got such a, what do we call it, erratic international climate out there, it makes the job doubly hard.
Stephen, what do you think she needs to get right in the back half of her term to leave a strong legacy rather than it being a cautionary tale?
Look, in simple terms, hit the inflation target and keep unemployment low. Now, sometimes there's a trade-off between the two, that sometimes when you're trying to get inflation lower, you cause unemployment to increase. And I think that's what we're seeing right now, with the unemployment rate creeping up as the RBA is tackling the inflation problem. But as the governor has said, and the deputy governor, Andrew Hauser, has said on many, many occasions, the best thing that they can do as a central bank to contribute to the economic well-being of the Australian people is hit the inflation target more often than not. And as we were touching on a moment ago, they haven't hit the inflation target, the 2.5%, for quite a while now. They got close, but they haven't quite achieved it. So I think her legacy will be judged on how she finishes up these next couple of years. If inflation can be 2.5%, plus or minus a little bit, of course, and importantly, the unemployment rate stays relatively low. That's sort of the true test for her, although some of the things in that space are more for the federal government, particularly when it comes to taxing and spending decisions in the economy more broadly. The Reserve Bank, and we've seen this in some state infrastructure spend, the metro tunnels in Sydney and Melbourne, the spending on the Olympic Games up in Brisbane, which is starting to gather some sort of momentum, that can put some pressure on the economy. And of course, they're important infrastructure projects, but they can add to, what do we call it, the heat in the economy if those public sector projects are really, really big and they actually consume a lot of resources and therefore add to inflation pressure.
What I'd love to know is if you were in her chair for the back half of this term, what would you do differently?
What would I do differently? Look, I think I'd be a little more inclined to have a focus on the unemployment rate. I think one of the bad things in an economy is high unemployment. I think most people would agree with that. And while our unemployment rate's still relatively low, it's still 700,000 people. So if you put in people terms rather than economic jargon, 4.4, 4.5 unemployment rate, there's still 700,000 people there. So I'd make sure that I kept an eagle eye on what is happening to the labour market while I'm still trying to manage the inflation problem. I would perhaps engage with the other economic bodies, so the people who are responsible for the lending criteria for the banks. If you are worried about a house price boom, now it's funny talking about that now that house prices are coming off, but if that is a concern of yours when it comes to perhaps the next rate cutting cycle, in a year or so's time, uh, put in tighter prudential regulations with the other authorities. So you speak to APRA and these sorts of people who supervise the banks, obviously liaise with the Treasury and the Treasurer on these sorts of things. But if you don't want, if you want to cut interest rates to protect jobs, but you don't want housing to be sort of unleashed with another big 20-30% price boom, then speak to the banks, implement some quantitative restrictions on lending for housing, and allow lending for business expansion to continue with low interest rates. And as you've been touching on several times, allow the people with a mortgage to actually get some relief in their monthly repayments.
Stephen, that's been a very illuminating read on how Michele Bullock's RBA tenure has gone so far and where it might be headed. Thank you for joining us on the Expert Exchange.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.